This is a Bible study for North Shields Evangelical Church on the topic of assisted dying and euthanasia. Please be aware that that's quite a difficult topic. You might find some of the things said difficult to listen to because of experience, and I'll try to do my best to address the issue as sensitively as possible. So, assisted dying, or assisted suicide, as it's sometimes called. Assisted dying is assisting somebody who wishes to end their own life to end their own life. Giving someone a syringe of lethal medications in which they can take it themselves. Whereas euthanasia is intentionally ending the life of a person in order to relieve suffering. Someone administering the lethal injection to the person who wishes to end their own life, or who is terminally unwell. To look at this issue, I'm going to read from the Bible in the book of Job, chapter 6, verses 1 to 14. Job was a man in the Bible who suffered greatly. Then Job replied, "If only my anguish could be weighed, and all my misery be placed on the scales, it would surely outweigh the sand of the seas. No wonder my words have been impetuous. The arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks in their poison. God's terrors are marshalled against me. Does a wild donkey bray when it has grass, or an ox bellow when it has fodder? Is tasteless food eaten without salt, or is there flavour in the sap of the mallow? I refuse to touch it. Such food makes me ill. Oh, that I might have my request, that God would grant what I hope for, that God would be willing to crush me, to let loose his hand and cut off my life. Then I would still have this consolidation, my joy and unrelenting pain, that I had not denied the words of the Holy One. What strength do I have that I should still hope? What prospects that I should be patient? Do I have the strength of stone? Is my flesh bronze? Do I have any power to help myself, now that success has been driven from me? Anyone who withholds kindness from a friend forsakes the fear of the Almighty." The terms assisted suicide and euthanasia might be 21st century terms, but the issues and emotions that drive the desire to end a person's suffering have been around for a very long time. In verse 8 we read, "Oh, that I might have my request, that God would grant what I hope for, that God would be willing to crush me, to let loose his hand and cut off my life." Job was experiencing immeasurable suffering that, from a human viewpoint, showed no signs of improving. He says, "What strength do I have that I should still hope? What prospects that I should be patient?" Job felt he had nothing to live for, and since his current situation was unbearable, and since he could only see things getting worse in the future, he desired that God would end his life there and then. Now, just to be clear, Job did not ask his friends to end his life. Job knew that the right to take and end a life belonged with God alone. Also, when Elijah asked God to end his life, in the book of Kings we read, he says, "I have had enough, Lord," Elijah said. "Take my life, I am no better than my ancestors." When Elijah asked God to end his life, God did not answer that prayer. In addition, when someone told King David that he'd killed Saul, at Saul's request, to end Saul's suffering, David considered this as an act of murder, not an act of kindness. In summary, the contents of the Bible would suggest that both assisted suicide and euthanasia are wrong and should not be encouraged or legally allowed. However, that is not all that can be derived from the Bible about the issue. The Bible does not gloss over the fact that suffering is a real problem, a really severe problem, and those who express the desire to end their life are real people with real emotions. As Job said, does a wild donkey bray when it has grass, or an ox bellow when it has fodder? Job is basically saying that he'd not be talking this way. He'd not be braying, bellowing, complaining, saying he wants to die if his situation was good. It is the severity of his situation in a fallen world that is driving him to think this way. We also need to remember that for many, the rightness or wrongness of assisted suicide and euthanasia, the rightness or wrongness of these things is not an academic question. People who debate these issues are not university professors, but real people experiencing really strong emotion in really difficult life situations. Job's first desire essentially isn't that his friends offer him a legal injection or tell him what they'd learnt at university about how wrong assisted dying is. Job's first desire was for someone to listen to him and appreciate the weight of his suffering. He says, "If only my anguish could be weighed and all my misery be placed on the scales, it would surely outweigh the sands of the seas." So my first point is, on the subject of assisted dying and euthanasia, my first point is, give an ear. Give an ear. For some people, maybe even many, saying I want to die is not a practical request, i.e., this is what I want you to do for me. For many, the exclamation, I want to die, is an expression of how severe their suffering is and their desperation that it would end. Our knee-jerk reaction to people who say I want to die is not simply don't be silly or sorry it's illegal and wrong. Our first reaction should be to listen, giving those who suffer the time and space to express just how they feel. As Job says, keep listening to my words and let this be your comfort. All this being said, some people will find themselves in a position where they are being asked to do more than just listen. Doctors, nurses, relatives, all of these may be asked to help somebody to end their own life as an act of kindness. The kindness of ending their suffering or hastening the death of a person with a terminal diagnosis. But is this the type of kindness that Job was asking for? Is this the type of kindness the Bible encourages? Is it kindness to help end someone's suffering through assisted suicide or euthanasia? And if the answer is no, what does kindness look like towards those who are terminally unwell? What does kindness look like to those who are suffering severely? What kindness should those who fear the Almighty show? Well, we should not only give ear, we should give wine. We should give wine. Many people would regard the Bible as an ancient book full of superstitious fluff. Something I found amazing was that this reportedly superstitious book called the Bible, it contains no recipes to cure illnesses that involve singing Kumbaya over a pot of boiled unicorns' tails mixed with the testicles of a baboon. Despite all the unscientific and superstitious medicine around at the time, the Bible only contains one bit of medical advice, and it happens to be grounded in evidence-based science. In the book of Proverbs we read, "Give strong drink to the one who is perishing, and wine to those in bitter distress. Let them drink and forget their poverty, and remember their misery no more." The Bible advocates the use of the first medicinal drug, alcohol, for the treatment of pain and the relief of suffering. Those who are perishing, those who it is known that they are going to die, those who are perishing should be given substances that will offer them some relief from their bitter distress. Though we cannot end a person's suffering, we can do what we want to ease it. We're not only to give wine, we're to give bread. In the book of Kings we read, Elijah went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." Elijah was in a situation so bad that death was preferred to living. The situation showed no signs of changing in his lifetime. It was chronic. However, God's immediate response was not to grant Elijah's request to end his life. God's first response was to give Elijah bread. God's second response was to give Elijah a listening ear. Reading from 1 Kings 19. Elijah lay down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there by his head was some baked bread over hot coals, and a jar of water. He ate and drank, and then lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he travelled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night, and the word of the Lord came to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Now, just to be clear, narrative passages in the Bible are generally not the best parts of the Bible to gain instructions about what God wants us to do and what God does not want us to do. The narratives in the Bible, the story parts, describe what happened. The narratives in the Bible, for example, describe polygamy happening. The narratives sometimes describe godly people doing ungodly things. They are descriptive, describing what happened, not prescriptive, saying this is what you and I should do. However, in this narrative, we see what God did. And since it is God who acts, we can assume that we should follow his example. God's first response was to give Elijah bread. During a time of chronic famine, giving bread would make Elijah's next few days a lot easier. This simple practical help enabled Elijah to get through the next few days. And a few chapters later we read that Elijah found his purpose in life again. In 1 Kings 19, Elijah had lost the will to live and lost all desire to be a prophet. By 2 Kings chapter 2, Elijah is making the most of his last few days on earth by supporting other prophets. Practical help enabled Elijah's situation to improve just enough so that his experience of living was a lot more positive. Those who express a desire to end their life usually fall into one of two categories. One, they are perishing. They have a diagnosis that will lead to death. In the first situation, the act of kindness Christians should offer is to relieve suffering, to work towards a good death, a good, natural death. Other people suffer because of a chronic condition. Their diagnosis leads to suffering on a daily basis. In this second situation, the act of kindness Christians should offer is to maximize the person's quality of life, easing suffering and helping them live as fulfilling a life as possible. God offered bread to Elijah, and his second response was to offer a listening ear. Twice God asked Elijah what was wrong. Twice God listened to Elijah's reply. This wasn't for the purpose of obtaining information for God's benefit. God already knew what was wrong before he asked. And God didn't ask again because he'd forgotten what Elijah said. The purpose of God's actions would seem to be therapeutic, helping Elijah work through his emotional response to his situation so that he was better able to face it. Now, I think it's really important to note that the success rate of all of the above is not 100%. Good palliative care may ease a person's suffering, but it would be untrue to say that it does so 100% for every terminally ill patient. Even with the best palliative care, not all die peacefully. A percentage of patients and relatives do experience distress. In much the same way, a percentage of people, despite the best chronic disease management around, a percentage of people will suffer and wish that their life would end. Would it not, in such cases, would it not be an act of kindness to help end a person's suffering through ending their life? Well, many of the arguments for assisted dying and euthanasia are very emotive and emotionally driven, you could say. We need to be sensitive to that. Seeing someone suffer can be very distressing, and the emotional impact should not be dismissed. In which they say, likewise, only somebody with a chronic disease understands just how truly distressing it is to suffer on a daily basis. All this being said, emotions are not always the best foundation to make ethical decisions. A person who works on death row might be sad that a person dies for their crimes. But that sadness is not a basis for them leaving the cell doors open at night. You or I might be angry that a person let their dog poo on our lawn, but that anger is not a basis for stabbing them in the back. Our emotions are not always the best guides to make good ethical decisions, especially when life or death is concerned. That's why in the Bible, the following argument is used to prohibit the murder of another human being. We read in Genesis 1, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them." This bit of paper is worth very little, whereas a bit of paper called a £50 note is worth so much more. In addition, this bit of metal is worth very little, whereas this bit of metal, you might get £3 for it in a London shop. Why is one worth more than the other? Because when something bears the image of something else, the thing that it is made in the image of gives it value. A £10 note has the image of the King or Queen of England's head, and that image gives that bit of paper value. This bit of metal is made in the image of Big Ben, and so Big Ben gives that bit of metal value. Because every human being is made in the image of God, every human being has value. Just think, the value of all the material ingredients that make up a human, all the potassium, all the carbon, all the phosphorus, all the water, the value of all these materials totals less than £10. However, because every human being is made in the image of God, every human is worth more than £10. Every human is worth more than a dog. Every human is worth more than any of us give credit. The person who is significantly, physically and intellectually disabled has value. The frail elderly person who feels she is only a burden to others has value. The unborn but unwanted child has value. Why? Because every human being is made in the image of God. And so every human being has worth, dignity, is worthy of dignity, compassion, and respect. In addition, God created mankind. And because God is the giver of life, only he has the right to take it away. We read in Genesis 9, "Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind." Within the Israelite law, taking the life of a human was prohibited, either premeditated murder or death through negligence and manslaughter. Man was not to take the life of another human, as it was not theirs for the taking. The only exceptions were God-given exceptions. The punishment for certain crimes was capital punishment. Someone who took a life in self-defense was not treated as a murderer. In situations of just war, the taking of another human life was permissible. In all other situations in which the life of another was taken, all of these situations were prohibited, for the decision about the life and death over another human being is not ours to take. So we're to give ear, we're to give wine, we're to give bread, we're to remember the giver of life who gives all life value, and we are to give protection. Some would say that denying a person the right to end their own life, some would say that that's an unkindness. They might argue that it is an act of mercy, an act of kindness to end a person's suffering, to prevent their long or short-term suffering. Aren't those who would make assisted suicide and euthanasia illegal being cruel? I think it's important to note that the default position of humans is not kindness. That's why we require laws. We read in the Bible in Timothy, the law is made not for the righteous, but for lawbreakers. Laws are needed to restrain our human bias towards acts of selfishness and unkindness. Laws that prevent assisted suicide and euthanasia also do the same. For example, in US states that have legalized assisted suicide, terminally ill patients have seen medical insurance companies refusing to fund their treatment, but offering to fund assisted suicide. Those who are elderly or suffering from chronic conditions may see themselves as a burden, or be seen as a burden by healthcare professionals, or even their own family. They might face pressure to end their own life to save others the burden and cost of looking after them, or they might be encouraged towards assisted suicide to speed up the acquisition of an inheritance. Some with severe learning difficulties and dementia are not able to speak up for themselves. It is not uncommon for healthcare professionals to make uninformed judgments about such people's quality of life and deny them treatment simply because they deem their life not worth living. In the book of Proverbs we are told, "Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and needy." Laws against assisted suicide and euthanasia help protect the vulnerable. They help protect healthcare professionals from being pressurized into making unwanted decisions. They help protect society from a slippery slope. Opening the door to assisted dying and euthanasia has had a domino effect in every society where it is legal. For example, in countries where assisted dying and euthanasia has been made legal, it's gone from being legal at the end of life to being legal at the onset of a chronic condition in Belgium. In Belgium, it used to just be legal for adults. It's now legal for children. In Canada, it used to be legal for the physically ill and now it's legal for those who are mentally ill. In the Netherlands, it was once legal for those with unbearable suffering, but now it's legal for those who are simply tired of living. Now, all this does not mean we need to do everything possible to prevent death at all costs. We read in Proverbs, "Give strong drink to the one who is perishing." When death approaches, when we or someone else is perishing, we are not morally obligated to do everything we can to avoid it. A person might be beyond the point where treatment would work. Actively treating them might actually add to their suffering. For these reasons, the UK medical system has DNAR orders and TEP forms. DNAR orders. These forms, which are kept in a bright yellow envelope, these forms inform healthcare professionals that a person is not to be resuscitated. This is usually in accordance with the person's wishes and the agreement of the healthcare professionals looking after them. CPR, that is, trying to revive a person who has stopped breathing and whose heart has stopped beating. CPR has a low success rate, a lot lower than TV would make out. CPR can result in a long stay on intensive care, from which many do not survive. CPR may revive a person to a point where they can only be kept alive artificially, which creates yet another ethical dilemma about the withdrawal or continuation of treatment. CPR is also traumatic physically for the person being resuscitated, and it's also emotionally traumatic for those who watch or who are involved. So though death is a sad and unwanted thing, it's not something that we can avoid forever, and doing our best to minimize suffering can be an act of kindness, whilst also letting nature take its course can be an act of kindness as well, and is not morally wrong. So that's DNARs. There's also something else called TEP forms. TEP forms are you can get TEP forms. These are treatment escalation plans, and they're forms used with patients to decide how much treatment they want to receive should their condition deteriorate. Do they want to go to intensive care to have machines take over their breathing, when they might never be well enough to get taken off? Do they want to go into hospital to receive scans that won't change their situation because they're facing a terminal illness? Do they want to undergo procedures that they might not survive? Again, I would suggest that doing our best to minimize suffering can be an act of kindness. Letting nature take its course is not morally wrong. So I hope that gives a summary of some of the issues about assisted dying and euthanasia. Realize that when people actually face those types of decisions or face situations that push them in those directions, it can be very, very difficult. But I hope you've been given some information that can help you think through these issues in a biblical and God-honouring way.